Every month, a stranger transferred $3,000 to me for 5 years. I never knew who the sender was. But one day, $22 million arrived with one phrase. My debt to you is paid. Good day, dear listeners. It's Anna again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for most of my adult life, I was the kind of woman people look straight through. I wasn't invisible by choice. It just happened the way most things happen when you're 33, recently divorced, raising a 9-year-old daughter on a librarian's salary in Portland, Oregon. Gradually, quietly, without anyone noticing or caring. My world was made of small, manageable things. The particular creak of the third step in our apartment building. Emma's backpack hanging crooked on the hook by the door. The smell of old paper that clung to my sweaters long after I'd left work. I had learned to find comfort in smallness. After Tom left, smallness felt safe. Tom had been charming in the way that certain men are charming. Completely, right up until the moment they stop. He walked out on a Tuesday morning when Emma was 3, said he needed to find himself, and found himself 6 months later in a condo in Seattle with a woman named Brittany who did spin classes and didn't ask hard questions. I didn't fight him. I didn't have the energy. I took the apartment, took Emma, took the silence, and rebuilt my life out of whatever pieces were left. I'd trained as a nurse once. That was before everything. I'd been 2 semesters from finishing my degree when my mother died, and something in me simply couldn't go back. The hospital smell, the fluorescent lights, the sound of monitors, they all felt like accusations. I finished a library science certificate instead, and I told myself it was fine. Books couldn't die on you. Books stayed exactly where you put them. So that was my life on the morning of October 14th, 9 years ago, when I checked my bank account on my phone while waiting for the coffee to brew and saw a deposit I didn't recognize. $3,000. Wire transfer. Sender. Private. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I called my bank. We can see the transfer originated from a private trust account, the representative told me, her voice cheerful and useless. We're not able to disclose further details without a formal investigation request. Would you like to file one? I said yes. The investigation took 6 weeks and concluded with a letter that said, essentially, that the money had been sent to me intentionally and legally, and that the sender had chosen to remain anonymous. There was nothing illegal. There was nothing to investigate. The money was mine. I sat with that for a long time. The obvious move was to send it back. But send it where? There was no return address, no name, no account number I could access. The bank's hands were tied. The money sat in my account like a question no one would answer. The following month, on the 14th again, another $3,000 appeared. I went back to the bank, filed another inquiry, got another careful apologetic letter. The money, again, was mine. By the 3rd month, I had stopped filing inquiries. By the 6th month, I had stopped trying to explain it to myself. By the 1st anniversary of the first deposit, the money had become part of my budget. Quietly, shamefully, like a secret I'd made peace with without ever understanding. What would you have done? Truly, what would you have done? I told no one except Meg, my best friend since college, who sat across from me at our usual corner table at the diner on Morrison Street and listened with her coffee cup halfway to her mouth. Someone's paying you $3,000 a month and you don't know who, she said. That's correct. Sarah. She set the cup down. That's either the most beautiful thing I've ever heard or the most terrifying. I know. I said. It was both. That was the answer I never said out loud. It was both, every single month, for 5 years. The money changed my life in the way that quiet money changes things. Not dramatically, but structurally. I paid off the last of my credit card debt. I put Emma in a better school. I saved. I didn't splurge, didn't travel, didn't buy anything I couldn't justify. The money felt borrowed somehow, like it wasn't fully mine until I understood where it came from. And I never understood. 5 years, 60 payments, $180,000 that arrived like clockwork on the 14th of every month from a source that remained, despite every effort, completely invisible to me. And then came the morning of October 14th, 5 years after the first deposit. I remember I was standing at the kitchen window with my coffee, watching Emma leave for school. She was 14 by then, tall, serious, with her father's jaw and my stubbornness, and she didn't look back when she walked away, the way teenagers don't. I watched until she turned the corner. Then I looked down at my phone. The notification had come in at 6:02 a.m. Deposit received, $22 million.00. I read it 3 times. Then a fourth. The number didn't change. Below the deposit amount, in the memo field, a space where people usually write things like rent or invoice number 447, there were 7 words. My debt to you is paid. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not because I fainted, not because I was overwhelmed with joy. I sat down because my legs stopped working, and the floor was the closest solid thing I could find. $22 million, and a debt I had no memory of creating. I stayed on the kitchen floor for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the microwave the entire time, the green numbers ticking forward while I sat with my back against the cabinet and my coffee going cold on the counter above me. $22 million does not feel the way you think it will feel. I had imagined, in my weaker moments over those 5 years, what it would be like to suddenly receive a large sum of money. Everyone does. You imagine relief, exhilaration, the particular lightness of a life suddenly freed from its financial constraints. You imagine calling your best friend and crying happy tears. You imagine taking your daughter somewhere with a beach and an ocean she hasn't seen yet. I felt none of those things. What I felt sitting on that kitchen floor in Portland on a gray October morning was the cold, specific weight of a question that had just become urgent. Someone had been paying me for 5 years. Someone who knew my name, my bank details, my address. Someone who had been watching me, in some sense, for 60 months. And now they had sent me $22 million and told me their debt was paid. What debt? What had I done? And why did it matter enough to be worth $22 million to someone? By the time I got to work that morning, the fear had settled into something more organized. I went through the motions, checked and returned books, helped a college student find a dissertation source, answered the phone twice. But my mind was running a different calculation entirely. Who knew me 10 years ago? Before the divorce? Before the library? Before Emma started school? I had been a nursing student. I had worked part-time at a coffee shop on Burnside. I had spent my weekends at my mother's house in Beaverton, helping her through the early stages of the illness that would eventually take her. My life had been small then, too, in the way young lives are small before they've had time to expand into their full shape. And then I remembered something I hadn't thought about in years. It was a Tuesday. I was 28 years old doing a clinical rotation through the urgent care clinic at Portland International Airport. A man had collapsed in Concourse C near the gate for a Delta flight to New York. He was in his 60s, heavy-set, in a good suit, and he was dying. his face the wrong color, his breathing wrong, his body folding toward the floor in that particular way that a body does when the heart forgets what it's for. I was the only medical person close enough to matter. I dropped my bag and I did what I had been trained to do. I performed CPR for 4 minutes until the AED arrived. I kept his airway clear. I talked to him. I don't know why. It wasn't in any textbook. I just kept saying, "Stay with me. Stay with me. I've got you." Until the paramedics pushed through the crowd and took over. He survived. I was pulled back by my supervising nurse before I could speak to him. There was paperwork, a debrief, a commendation that went into a file I never saw again. Someone from his travel party, a young woman in a dark blazer, tried to find me afterward, but I had already moved on to the next patient, the next corridor, the next moment. 3 weeks later, my mother was diagnosed with the aggressive form of the cancer that would kill her in 8 months. I withdrew from nursing school. I never went back to that airport. I had not thought about the man in the suit in years, but now, sitting at my reference desk with the weight of $22 million in my bank account, I thought about almost nothing else. Could it be him? Was that possible? Was a single act of CPR on a Tuesday afternoon worth 5 years of payments and $22 million? After work, I picked Emma up from school, fed her, helped her with her algebra homework, and waited until she was asleep before I sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen and started writing down everything I knew: the dates, the amounts, the memo field, the things I remembered about that day in the airport, the things I needed to find out. Here was what I understood. I needed to know who had sent this money before anyone else decided for me what it meant, because $22 million doesn't arrive in your account without consequences, legal ones, tax ones, the kind that follow you into courtrooms if you're not careful. And here was what I feared, that whoever had sent the money was dead. That the phrase, "my debt to you is paid," was the kind of thing a person says when they are settling accounts before the end. That I was holding $22 million with no living person to explain it to me, and that somewhere out there, someone, a family, a lawyer, a set of people with far more resources than I had, was going to come looking for it. My first plan was simple, the way first plans always are before reality complicates them. Step 1. Find a lawyer. Not a divorce lawyer, not the overworked public defender I'd used 9 years ago, a real one. An estates and trusts attorney who understood large sums of money and the legal architecture around them. Step 2. Contact the bank formally and demand every document they could legally provide about the source of the transfers. Step 3. Search the public records for what I could find about the man in the airport. I didn't have a name, but I had a date, a location, a flight number I vaguely remembered seeing on the departure board, and the memory of a young woman in a dark blazer who had tried to find me after. It wasn't much, but I had spent 5 years building a life out of whatever pieces were available. I knew how to work with not much. I closed the legal pad. I turned off the kitchen light. And for the first time in 5 years, I lay in bed and didn't sleep, staring at the ceiling and listening to the particular silence of a life that was about to become something completely different. The law offices of Adler and Pierce were on the 14th floor of a glass building on SW Fifth Avenue, the kind of building where the lobby smells like money and the receptionist wears a headset and doesn't smile unless she means it. I had found Thomas Adler through a recommendation from a colleague whose husband had gone through a messy inheritance dispute 2 years prior. He's not warm, she'd told me, but he's brilliant and he's honest, which in this field is rarer than it should be. I booked the earliest available appointment, which was 3 days after the deposit. 3 days during which I checked my bank balance approximately 40 times, as though the number might shrink if I didn't watch it. Thomas Adler was 61, trim, with the kind of face that had settled into permanent skepticism. He listened to me for 12 minutes without interrupting. Then he asked me to repeat the exact wording of the memo field. "My debt to you is paid," I said. He wrote it down on a yellow legal pad, and the prior transfers, 60 months at $3,000. Did you report those as income? I had. My accountant had treated them as miscellaneous income for 5 years. I had the tax returns to prove it. Good, he said. That matters. He tapped his pen against the pad. Ms. Mitchell, in my experience, when a sum of this size arrives with that kind of language, it is almost always connected to a will, specifically to a bequest that was arranged privately, outside of the standard estate process. Why would someone do it that way? I asked. To avoid scrutiny, he said simply. From family, from the IRS, potentially, or from people who might have contested the bequest before it was completed. He paused. I want to file a formal inquiry with the originating financial institution and cross-reference the transfer dates against recent probate filings in Oregon and the surrounding states. If this man is deceased, and the language strongly suggests he is, there will be a record. I gave him everything I had, the bank statements, the tax returns, the approximate date and location of the airport incident. He looked at me over his glasses when I finished explaining the CPR story. That's your connection, he said quietly. I'd bet my practice on it. He filed the inquiry that afternoon. What I did not know, while Thomas Adler was drafting his letter to the bank, was that 40 miles south of Portland, in a lakefront house in Lake Oswego, 2 people were having a very different kind of conversation about the same $22 million. Victoria Hartwell was 50 years old and had inherited her father's cheekbones and none of his patience. She was the only child of Richard Callaway, retired founder of Callaway Pacific, a shipping logistics company that had made him quietly, structurally wealthy in the way that doesn't make headlines, but does make lawyers very busy. Richard had sold the company 11 years ago and spent the last decade of his life in the lakefront house, painting watercolors badly and giving money away to causes Victoria considered sentimental. Her husband, Derek Hartwell, was in real estate development. He was the kind of man who wore expensive watches and remembered everyone's name and salary simultaneously. He had married Victoria 14 years ago, and their relationship had the quality of a business partnership that had grown too entangled to dissolve. They had been expecting the inheritance. Richard had died 6 weeks earlier, quietly, of a second heart attack. He was 71. The family had gathered for a brief, dry funeral. Victoria had begun making lists. Then Richard's estate attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, had called and informed them that the primary estate, the house, the accounts, the investments, was substantially smaller than projected because a significant portion of Richard's liquid assets had been placed over the past 5 years into a private trust with a single beneficiary, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, a librarian in Portland. "Who is she?" Victoria had asked, her voice very controlled. Gerald Foss had read from the trust document. The beneficiary was named in the grantor's personal directive as an individual who, on or around October 14th, 15 years ago, rendered life-saving medical assistance to the grantor at Portland International Airport. The silence after that sentence had lasted a long time. Derek had spoken first. "Can we contest it?" "On what grounds?" Gerald Foss asked carefully. on the grounds that my father-in-law was an old man who apparently decided to give our inheritance to a stranger based on a medical incident that happened 15 years ago, Victoria said. The trust is legally sound, Gerald Foss said. It was established 8 years ago, reviewed annually, and the grantor's mental competency was documented at each review. Contesting it will be difficult and expensive. Victoria had hung up. Then she had looked at her husband, and they had begun making a different kind of list. I learned this only later. At the time, I knew nothing about Victoria Hartwell or her husband. I was standing in my kitchen 2 weeks after filing Thomas's inquiry when a FedEx envelope arrived, addressed to me by name, with a return address I didn't recognize. The law offices of Gerald Foss, Lake Oswego, Oregon. Inside was a sealed letter, handwritten. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, the kind that cost more per sheet than my lunch. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened it. Dear Ms. Mitchell, if you are reading this, then the trust has been executed as I intended, and I am no longer alive to say these words to you in person. I am sorry for that. I have wanted to say them for a long time. My name is Richard Calloway. On October 14th, 15 years ago, you saved my life in Concourse C at Portland International Airport. You were a nursing student. You were alone. You had no reason to stop and every reason to walk past. You were off duty. You were young. You were a stranger. But you stopped. You knelt down on the floor of a busy airport in front of hundreds of people, and you worked to keep me alive, and you kept talking to me. Stay with me, stay with me. And I did. I never forgot your voice. I never forgot those words. I spent years trying to find a way to thank you that was proportionate to what you gave me. There is no such thing, of course, but this is my best effort. The monthly payments were meant to give you stability while I figured out the rest. The final sum is the rest. Do not let anyone tell you it is anything other than exactly what it is. A debt, freely acknowledged, freely paid, with more gratitude than I can put into words. R.C. I read it 4 times. Then I put it face down on the table and pressed both hands flat against the surface, as though I needed to feel something solid. Richard Calloway. I typed the name into my phone. Within 30 seconds, I had his photograph. A LinkedIn profile from years ago, a company announcement, an obituary dated 6 weeks prior. I recognized him immediately. Older, heavier, gray at the temples, but unmistakably the man on the floor of Concourse C. He'd been alive for 15 years because of 4 minutes of CPR, and he had spent every one of those 15 years deciding what that was worth. I held the letter to my chest, and I did not know whether to laugh or to cry, so I did both, sitting alone at my kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon while the rain came down outside the window and my whole life changed its shape around me. Thomas Adler called me the morning after I received Richard's letter. Gerald Foss reached out, he said. Richard Calloway's estate attorney. He's cooperative. The trust documentation is airtight, and Foss himself is on record as supporting its validity. The originating institution has provided full confirmation. The money is yours, legally and completely. What we need to do now is establish your narrative clearly and publicly before anyone else tries to establish it for you. What does that mean practically? I asked. It means I want to file a declaratory judgment action, a preemptive legal statement that establishes your rightful ownership before a challenge can be mounted. It also means we archive every document we have, Richard's letter, the trust deed, the airport incident records, your employment records from that period, your tax history. We build a wall of paper, Ms. Mitchell. Paper is what protects people in situations like this. I agreed to everything. I authorized Thomas to proceed. What I did not know, still, at that point, was that Derek Hartwell had already hired his own attorney. I found out on a Thursday afternoon, 10 days after receiving Richard's letter, when I came home from work to find a car parked across the street from my building. Not unusual, except it was still there when I walked Emma to school the next morning, and the morning after that. On the fourth day, I took a photo of the license plate and sent it to Thomas. He ran it through a contact and called me back within the hour. "It's registered to a private investigations firm," he said. His voice was careful, professional. "The Hartwell family has hired investigators. They are watching you." I stood in the middle of my kitchen and felt the specific cold of being surveilled, the knowledge that someone had decided I was a problem to be studied. "Is that legal?" I asked. "In public spaces, yes. On your street, watching your building. It walks a line. I want you to document everything. Times, dates, photographs, and I want you to call me immediately if anyone attempts to contact you directly." 2 days later, someone attempted to contact me directly. I was leaving the library at 5:45 p.m. when a woman in a gray coat stepped out of a black SUV and said my name. She was my age, blonde in the careful way that requires maintenance, and she had the particular composure of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted before she'd finished asking for it. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, "I'm Victoria Hartwell. I'm Richard Calloway's daughter." I stopped. I had done enough reading by then to know exactly who she was. "My attorney has advised me not to speak with you without representation present," I said. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. "I just want to talk." "I'm sure you do," I said. "Please contact Thomas Adler. He handles all communication on this matter." I walked to my car. My hands were steady. My heart was not. She didn't follow me. But 2 days later, Thomas received a letter from the Hartwell family's attorney, a man named Gregory Slade, who had a 12-page website and 3 different awards from the Oregon State Bar Association, announcing their intention to contest the trust on the grounds of undue influence and the grantor's alleged diminished cognitive capacity in his final years. Thomas called me immediately. "They're claiming Richard wasn't mentally competent when he established the trust." "He established it 8 years ago," I said. "You told me it was reviewed annually." It was, and Gerald Foss has documentation of Richard's cognitive assessments at every review, signed by his personal physician. This claim will not hold. Thomas paused. "But that's not the point of it, Ms. Mitchell. The point of it is to cost you enough time and money and stress that you settle. Slade's strategy is exhaustion." That night, after Emma was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with Richard's letter in front of me. I read the last line again. "Do not let anyone tell you it is anything other than exactly what it is. A debt, freely acknowledged, freely paid." He had known. He had known they would try. I picked up my pen and I wrote 3 words at the top of my legal pad. "I will not." The next morning, I called Thomas and told him to proceed with every legal measure available to us. The escalation came faster than I expected. I was at the grocery store on a Saturday when Derek Hartwell appeared at the end of the frozen food aisle. He was taller than his photographs, with the kind of confident physical presence that reminded me of Tom in his worst years. The stance of a man who had never learned that space belongs to everyone. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, not a question. He said it the way people say things when they already know the answer and want you to feel the knowing. I kept my cart between us. "Mr. Hartwell, contact Thomas Adler." "We can make this easy," he said. his voice low and smooth. Richard was an old man who made an impulsive decision based on a sentimental memory. You are a stranger to him. The family has a legitimate claim, and fighting this will cost you far more than it's worth. We're prepared to offer you a settlement. $500,000, clean, no litigation, no stress. Walk away from the rest. $500,000. He said it the way you'd offer someone a glass of water. Mr. Hartwell, I said, if you contact me in person again, I will have my attorney file a harassment complaint. Please leave me alone. I turned my cart and walked to a different aisle. My hands were shaking by the time I reached the cereal section, and I didn't notice until I knocked an entire box of oatmeal off the shelf and stood there staring at it on the floor for several seconds before I remembered how to bend down and pick things up. I called Thomas from the parking lot. He documented the encounter immediately. Then he called Slade directly and warned them that further direct contact would result in a restraining order. The Hartwells went quiet after that. Not gone. The P.Y.'s car still appeared occasionally, but quiet. No more parking lot ambushes. No more gray coat confrontations outside the library. Thomas said it was a tactical retreat. They're regrouping, he told me. Don't mistake silence for surrender. He was right, of course. But I was exhausted in a way I hadn't been in years. The kind of exhaustion that isn't about sleep, but about carrying something heavy and having to pretend, for Emma's sake, and the library's sake, and the sake of everyone around you, that you're not carrying it at all. I asked Thomas for 2 weeks before the next hearing date. He gave me 10 days. I took Emma to the Oregon coast. We stayed in a small rental house in Cannon Beach with a fireplace and a kitchen that smelled like cedar. We walked on the beach in the evenings and ate fish tacos and played card games after dinner. She told me about a boy at school she had a crush on. I listened the way mothers listen, with one part of my mind entirely present and another part quietly, gratefully astonished that she was still willing to tell me things. I didn't think about the Hartwells for 4 days. On the 5th day, I thought about them for exactly 1 hour, sitting on the porch with coffee while Emma slept, and then I set it aside again. The ocean doesn't care about trust funds. The waves do what they do regardless of who's watching. I came back from that trip different, quieter in the right way. The fear was still there, but it had moved to a different location, somewhere lower, more controlled, where it could fuel me instead of paralyze me. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after Emma and I returned from Cannon Beach. It wasn't Gregory Slade this time. It wasn't Victoria or Derek. It was a man I'd never heard of. A financial consultant named Mark Renner who said he was reaching out on behalf of certain interested parties who believed the situation could be resolved to everyone's mutual benefit. He was smooth. They always are. The smoothness was the tell. The practiced warmth of someone who spent his professional life making things that weren't reasonable sound like they were. Ms. Mitchell, he said, I represent clients who are prepared to offer you $1.2 million in an immediate, unconditional transfer in exchange for a signed relinquishment of all claims to the Callaway Trust. No litigation, no court appearances. The money would be in your account within 72 hours. $1.2 million, more than twice Derek's grocery store offer. Thank you for calling, I said. Please contact Thomas Adler. I don't discuss this matter without representation. Ms. Mitchell, with respect, your attorney is charging you by the hour. This offer would... Thomas Adler, I said. His number is available on his firm's website. Have a good day. I hung up. Then I sat with my phone in my hands for a moment, and I noticed, with some interest, that I felt almost nothing. Not tempted, not frightened, not even particularly angry, just clear, the way cold water is clear. I called Thomas to report the contact. He was already aware Renner had apparently tried his office first, been rebuffed, and then somehow obtained my cell number, which was its own violation that Thomas noted for the file. "They're phishing," Thomas told me. "The cognitive incapacity argument isn't going to hold, and they know it. Gerald Foss submitted Richard's full medical and psychological evaluation records last week. His attending physician has agreed to testify. Richard was, by every documented measure, in excellent cognitive health at the time he established the trust and at every annual review thereafter." He paused. "They're trying to settle because the alternative is losing." "What does losing look like for them?" I asked. "Expensive," Thomas said. "Not just financially. Richard's will included a separate clause, a standard one in estates of this kind, that states that if any beneficiary contests the will without standing and loses, they are responsible for all legal fees incurred by the estate and by other beneficiaries during the contest. It's called a no-contest clause. If the Hartwells lose, they pay your legal bills. Mine. Gerald Foss's. All of it." I let that sink in. "They're not just risking losing the $22 million, I said slowly. "They're risking losing everything they spend fighting me too." "Correct," Thomas said, "which is why the offers are escalating. They'd rather pay you $1 million than lose $4 million. I told Meg everything that evening. We sat in the corner booth at our diner on Morrison, the same booth we'd shared for 15 years, and I laid it all out. Richard's letter, Victoria's approach outside the library, Derek in the grocery store, Mark Renner's phone call. I kept my voice low and even, the way I'd learned to talk about difficult things without the emotion breaking through. Meg listened without interrupting, which was remarkable for her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You're doing the right thing," she said finally. "I know." "You're not taking the settlement." "No." She nodded. "Good." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Sarah, do you understand what he was doing? Richard? Those monthly payments, $3,000 every month for 5 years. He wasn't just sending you money, he was watching over you, making sure you were okay." I hadn't thought of it in exactly those terms. The idea settled over me strangely. The image of an elderly man I'd never met, sitting in his lakefront house in Lake Oswego, looking at my name in a bank transfer record once a month, and knowing from a distance that I was still there, still okay, still alive. "He never introduced himself," I said. "He never reached out, never tried to meet me." "Some people express gratitude like that," Meg said quietly. Quietly. "From a distance. Because they know that showing up changes things, and they didn't want to change your life. They just wanted to make it a little easier." I thought about the years the payments had covered. The year Emma started middle school, and I'd been terrified about the tuition. The year my car died and I'd needed a new one without going into debt. The year I'd had to take 2 weeks off work for a minor surgery, and the payments had meant I didn't have to panic about the income gap. He had been there for every one of those moments, invisibly without asking for anything in return, just a number on a bank statement and an inexplicable sense that someone, somewhere, was paying attention. "I'm keeping it," I said, not defensively, just clearly. Meg raised her coffee cup. "Of course you are." Thomas had also been building something of his own. He had secured depositions from 3 of Richard's former business associates, who confirmed Richard's sharp mind and deliberate character in the years before his death. He had obtained the complete medical file, which showed Richard had undergone annual neurological evaluations, not because he had to, but because he'd chosen to, apparently with the specific intention of creating an unimpeachable record of his competency. Richard Callaway had spent 8 years building a legal fortress around this gift. He had anticipated his family's response before he was gone. That, perhaps more than anything else, told me who he was. Victoria Hartwell called me on a Wednesday morning, 4 weeks before the scheduled court hearing, and asked if we could meet for coffee. Not her attorney, not a financial consultant. Her, personally, her voice measured and surprisingly soft, saying she thought we had gotten off on the wrong foot and that she'd like the chance to speak woman to woman without lawyers. I called Thomas before I replied. "It's a tactic," he said immediately. "I know, but I want to hear what she says." He was quiet for a moment. "If you go, you say nothing substantive. You do not agree to anything. You do not express sympathy for her position or acknowledge her characterization of Richard's mental state, and you tell me everything afterward." Understood. We met at a cafe in the Pearl District that Victoria had chosen. Deliberately, I thought, upscale and quiet. The kind of place where you're expected to speak in moderated tones and nothing you say gets overheard. She was already seated when I arrived, in a cream blouse that matched the walls, a leather bag over the back of her chair. She looked composed, but something around her eyes was different, tighter. "Thank you for coming," she said, as though I'd done her a favor. I sat down. I ordered water. I waited. "I want to apologize," she said, "for Derek's approach in the supermarket. That was inappropriate. He has a way of handling things that I don't always agree with." "Okay," I said. She looked at me as though she'd expected more, a softening, a reciprocation. I gave her nothing. "Sarah. Can I call you Sarah?" She didn't wait for an answer. "I want you to understand something. My father was a brilliant man. He was also, in his later years, a very lonely one. My mother passed when I was in my 20s. He never really recovered from that. And I genuinely believe, that your story, what happened in the airport, became something symbolic to him, something he built up over the years into more than it was." "More than saving his life?" I said. She smiled, just barely. "It was CPR, Sarah. You did what any medical professional would do. I'm not diminishing that, truly. But $22 million is—" She shook her head. "It's not proportionate to the action. It suggests that his thinking about this had become distorted over time. And that worries me. Not for the money's sake, for my father's memory's sake." It was beautifully done. I had to give her that. Every word calibrated to sound like concern rather than greed, like filial love rather than legal strategy. If I had been softer, or more uncertain, or more in need of being understood, it might have worked. "Victoria," I said, "your father spent 8 years building a legal record of his competency, specifically because he knew this moment would come. He had his cognition assessed annually. He had his attorney review the trust every year. He wrote me a letter by hand that I have in a safe in my home, in which he explained exactly who he was, what happened between us, and what he intended the money to mean." She opened her mouth. I kept going. "He knew you would contest it. He prepared for it. He did everything a competent person does when they make a decision they know someone else will try to undo. And what that tells me, Victoria, is not that he was confused. It tells me he knew you." The composure cracked, only for a second, a flash of something hot and unguarded behind her eyes. And then it was back, but I had seen it. "The offer on the table is fair," she said, her voice cooler now. $1.5 million, and this is over. You go back to your life. They'd raised it again, from Mark Renner's 1.2 to 1.5. The escalation confirmed everything Thomas had said about their position. "My attorney handles all settlement discussions," I said. I put $20 on the table for the water I hadn't drunk and stood up. "Sarah." Her voice stopped me, and it had changed again. Lower, with an edge I hadn't heard before. "You should think carefully about the kind of enemies you're making. We have resources you don't. This will get ugly." I looked at her for a moment. She was 50 years old and she was afraid, not of losing the money, but of what it meant to lose it, of being the woman whose father had preferred a stranger. That fear was doing most of the talking. "Have your attorney contact Thomas Adler," I said. I walked out into the Pearl District on a clear October afternoon, the air with that particular sharpness that comes before winter, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment with my heart going fast and my hands in my coat pockets, fingers curled into fists. Was I afraid? Yes. In the honest, bodily way. The way your nervous system responds to a threat before your mind has time to evaluate it. Victoria's last words had been a threat, understated and precise, the kind that lands because it doesn't need to be explicit. But fear, I had learned over the previous months, is not the same thing as doubt. Fear is information. It tells you that something matters, that there is something worth protecting. I was afraid, and the fear sat in my chest like a coal. Something that could burn if I let it go wrong, or something that could warm me from the inside if I held it correctly. I chose the latter. I took the MAX train home. I called Thomas from the platform. I told him everything, word for word, including the final threat. "She just handed us something very useful," he said. "I want you to write down what she said verbatim, time-stamped. Tonight. That language, you should think carefully about the kind of enemies you're making, constitutes implied intimidation. I'll add it to the file." "Thomas," I said, "how are we looking?" He was quiet for exactly one beat too long, which was not like him. "We're looking very good," he said finally, "but I want you to be prepared for it to get harder before it gets easier. The Hartwells are not going to go quietly." "I know," I said. "Are you ready?" I looked out the window of the train at the city going past. The bridges, the river, the buildings going amber in the late afternoon light. My city, the place I had made my life in the only way I knew how, steadily and quietly and without anyone helping much. "Yes," I said, "I'm ready." The hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning in November. I wore the gray dress I reserved for important things and drove myself downtown in the rain, the kind of steady Pacific Northwest rain that isn't dramatic, just persistent. I arrived 40 minutes early and sat in the hall outside the courtroom with a coffee I didn't drink. There was nothing left to go over. Thomas and I had spent 3 weeks doing nothing else. Thomas arrived at 8:45. He sat down beside me. "There's something new," he said. Gerald Foss had found Richard's personal journal during the final estate inventory. The relevant entries had been submitted to the court as late evidence that morning, and Slade had had them for 90 minutes. Thomas showed me a page in a clear plastic sleeve, Richard's handwriting, firm, precise, November 2nd. Victoria was polite in the way that means she wants something. Derek wants to discuss restructuring the estate planning. I know what that means. I am not senile and I am not confused. My intention regarding the trust is unchanged and will remain so. Sarah Mitchell gave me 15 more years of life. What I owe her is mine to decide. March 15th. V&D came to the house today, unannounced. They asked about the estate again. I am noting this because I believe they may attempt to characterize my decisions as the product of outside influence. They are not. I am the influence. I have always been the only influence over my own life. He knew, I said. He documented everything because he knew exactly what they would do. Not only that, Thomas said. Slade contacted me an hour ago requesting a postponement because when he read those journal entries, he understood what had happened. Richard's own words describe years of pressure from his family to alter his estate plans, the very behavior the Hartwells accuse me of facilitating. If they're arguing undue influence, and Richard's diary shows the influencing was done by the Hartwells themselves, their case doesn't just fail, it inverts. They're going to ask for a settlement, I said. At the courthouse steps, Thomas confirmed, within the hour. They were already in the hallway. Victoria, her composure fraying at the edges. Derek behind her, the grocery store confidence entirely gone. Gregory Slade stepped forward. Mr. Adler, we'd like to discuss resolution before we proceed. Thomas looked at me. I looked at Slade. We'll hear the offer, I said. My clients are prepared to withdraw the contest in full, Slade said. No settlement, I said. He stopped. I'm sorry? We proceed with the hearing. Ms. Mitchell, the contest is being withdrawn. Your claim is intact. There's nothing more to win. There's accountability, I said. Your clients made direct contact with me twice. They hired investigators to surveil my home. Victoria threatened me in a public cafe, and Richard Calloway's own journal describes them pressuring him for years, which is the behavior they accuse me of. I want all of that on the record. Thomas addressed Slade quietly. They have no case. The journals, the medical records, the depositions, take this into the courtroom and they lose on every point. And when they lose, the no contest clause triggers, and your clients pay every dollar of every legal bill this process has generated. Slade looked at his clients. Derek looked at the floor. Victoria looked at me. Why are you doing this? She said. Something stripped and genuine beneath the controlled voice. Because your father asked me to stay with him, I said. And I did. And then he spent 15 years returning the favor. I'm not going to let you take that from either of us. We walked into the courtroom. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Richard's physician testified to his cognition. His business associates testified to his character. Gerald Foss read the journal entries aloud in a courtroom that was completely silent. At one point, Victoria turned her face away. I couldn't be certain what that meant. Judge Chen took a 40-minute recess. When she returned, she didn't take long. Judge Chen's ruling was 14 pages long. I read it at the kitchen table that evening with Emma doing homework across from me, unaware that anything important was happening. She ruled that the Calloway Trust was valid in every respect, that Richard had been in full possession of his cognitive faculties throughout, that the bequest to Sarah Ann Mitchell was a deliberate and repeatedly considered expression of his autonomous will. And then the no contest clause. The Hartwells had lost on every point. They were responsible for all legal fees incurred by the estate and by the trust beneficiary during the dispute. Thomas called while I was still reading. Their total liability comes to approximately $430,000, plus whatever Slade charged them. It's done? I asked. It's done. The money is yours, Sarah. All of it. Emma looked up from her textbook. Mom, are you okay? Better than fine, I said. Gregory Slade filed a motion to reconsider. Judge Chen denied it without comment. The Hartwells paid the court-ordered fees within 60 days, not graciously, but because even Derek understood the limits of aggression by then. Richard's journal entries were now in the public record, his own written account of years of pressure from his daughter and son-in-law, permanently accessible in Multnomah County. No criminal charges followed, but the portrait was there, who they had been to a lonely old man who had loved them anyway. I kept my job at the library. People found that baffling. But the library was where I had rebuilt myself after the worst years. Wealth doesn't replace the things that make you feel solid. It just gives you more options for protecting them. I called Meg and took her to dinner at a restaurant we'd told ourselves for years was for other people. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Like I can breathe," I said. "Like I've been holding my breath for 15 years without knowing it." She raised her glass. "To Richard Calloway." I raised mine. "To Richard Calloway." The year after the ruling was the quietest of my adult life. I started a small foundation. No public name, no announcements. $4 million directed toward the things I had needed in my own hardest years. Assistance for single parents in job training, scholarships for nursing students, library programming in underserved schools. I showed up to board meetings in the same clothes I wore to work. Nobody needed to know where the money came from. I took Emma to Paris for spring break. We walked until our feet gave out, stood in front of paintings, and said very little. On the flight home, she fell asleep on my shoulder, and I looked out at the darkness below and thought about Richard, about the fact that he never got to see any of this. I hoped, in the way you hope things that can't be proven, that somehow he knew. Victoria and Derek sold the lakefront house in March. They moved somewhere smaller. They were not ruined. I want to be accurate about that. But the inheritance they had been building toward was gone. Not because I took it. Richard had arranged his own affairs. I simply declined to let them unmake his decisions. Thomas sent me a Christmas card. Well done. Just that. I put it on the refrigerator. What would you have done? Standing in that grocery store aisle, hearing that offer. Sitting across from that woman in the Pearl District Cafe. Holding that letter in a courtroom hallway. I'd love to know. If this story moved you, leave a comment, share it, and if you haven't yet, subscribe, because there are more stories like this one. Stories about the kind of quiet courage that doesn't make the news, but changes everything anyway. Thank you for staying with me to the end.